All right, welcome to episode 67 of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we welcome back a very special guest. We welcome back Samir Chopra. He's a professor of philosophy at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. He's the author of several books, including A Legal Theory for Autonomous Artificial Agents. And today we're going to be discussing the history of psychedelic use, its potential benefits according to recent research, and its dangers. Welcome, Samir.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me on again. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for coming back on again. And so, Samir, going into, I guess, just diving into the topic sort of head on. So can you tell us a little bit about your background in psychedelic research and especially what got you sort of started in it and what made you interested in the field altogether?
That's a great question. I think one really good way to answer it and to sort of cut to the chase is that a large part of the reason why I study philosophy today, or why I got into philosophy, was because of my experience with psychedelics. And, sometimes when I say this to people, it sort of induces giggles in the audience. It's like, philosophers and psychedelics. And it almost sounds like a cliche, and yet at the same time, it just makes perfect sense that if you're curious about the nature of reality, if you're curious about the relationship between our thoughts and the world outside of us, if you're curious about the nature of our consciousness, and you look at the history of psychedelics, these sorts of questions are sort of at the forefront of the kinds of experiences that people have had in psychedelics, the kinds of queries that have taken people into the world of psychedelics, and the kinds of insights that people claim to have had, consisting of answers to precisely these questions. What's the nature of reality? What's the relationship between my mind and the rest of the world? What's the nature of my consciousness? And these are, I would say, three very central questions in philosophy. And these are three questions that are very central to the psychedelic enterprise. And, the thoughtful psychonaut, the person that takes psychedelics and really thinks through his psychedelic experience. And I think very importantly does what I would call reintegration or revisitation, or, it's not just the tourism of the trip, but it's also the coming back home and figuring out what the journey meant. And I think those sorts of things go well with a philosophical disposition. And so to return this all the way back to where I started answering your question, one of the reasons I studied philosophy was because some of the ways in which I was curious about the kinds of questions that philosophers engaged in were also questions that were sparked by my psychedelic experiences at the time. And it also played a huge role in my mind, going back to something we talked about on the last podcast when I was here, when I was grieving, when I was actually anticipating my mother's death because she was a terminally ill patient. And when I processed her death afterwards, in both these experiences, I would say my psychedelic experiences had a role in helping me understand what was going on, and I think played a significant role. And I think at that time I was very, very intensely curious. I read into the history of psychedelic usage across cultures, across time, across. I learned of its interactions with philosophy, and of course, at the time that I was engaged in this kind of reading, in the mid 1990s, psychedelics were this illegal underground phenomena, as they had been for a long time. And part of the reason why the history was so fascinating for me was precisely because it had this strong connection with psychiatric research, with psychotherapeutic considerations. And it seemed like a very commonsensical sort of connection to make that a substance that helped you explore consciousness, that according to all reports, all sincere reports brought back by those that had experienced psychedelics, was giving them acute, profound insight into the nature of consciousness and their relationship to what we perceive as reality. That this was this is a sort of a golden doorway into this world of exploration, research, introspection, guided research, guided introspection. And yet, as we all know, it was shut down by, I think, but something I can only describe as a kind of a paranoid, hysterical, ill-motivated governmental response to make it illegal. And, and understanding that and sort of then understanding its, it's possible political significance, it opened up other philosophical dimensions of this to me. And then as, in the last few years, I would say starting in the last, ever since I first thought about these experiences and talked to many other people who had undertaken them, I think I became very interested in its therapeutic potential. I became very interested in its therapeutic potential for people that were grief-stricken. That was my initial point of entry in helping to understand our relationship with death, which grew out of psychedelic insights into the nature of our consciousness and our body and our physical being and the rest of the world outside.
And can you tell us a little bit about that? About some of the...
like, what were your experiences like, and what did they teach you exactly?
Mm-hmm.
I think, I had several of these insights. I think one was, around the time of my mother's death, and the other was about 9 years ago when I was in Amsterdam. And I think on these two times, there's something that is always reported which is, I think, universal to the psychedelic experience. And I think it unites the psychedelic experience with what I call the poetic vision, the sense of cosmic oneness, unity. Rabindranath Tagore said, I became a poet the day I realized that all was one.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, after that, I could only write poetry. That was the only way I could try and capture what had come alive within me was to express it in poetry. And I think that very experience, when I thought about what death entailed, when I thought about death in conjunction with that feeling, I re-understood death. I reinterpreted death. I understood death not as a destruction, not as an extinction, but I understood it as a kind of a transformation. I understood it as a kind of a reabsorption, as a kind of redistribution of myself, as a kind of that there was a particular role that I had played with respect to all of the world before then. I had to actually quote a lyric from the Grateful Dead. I had become the eyes of the world, right, for the time that I was alive. And now, if I was going to die, I would not be the eyes of the world, at least in the ways that I understood my old eyes. But I would go back to being part of the world in the way that I'd been before. Yeah. So I wasn't being destroyed. I was being reabsorbed, drawn into, and these metaphors were abundant and wonderful. Being reabsorbed, redrawn back, taken back into the bosom of the enveloping Mother Earth in some ways. I didn't feel like I was going to be lost. I felt I was actually going to go home. I remember actually saying to my wife at that time, I said, actually, I used to grieve at the thought that we would be separated by death. Mm. And I said, actually, I've realized that there's actually nothing to grieve for because we're not going anywhere. Mm. And I felt it in what William James calls this noetic sense. I knew it. It wasn't, oh, I thought it or I speculated it. I knew it. And it was, yeah. And for me at that moment, it was authoritative, and the emotional signature of that persists. So I think being able to reinterpret death, recast it, suffuse it with some understanding as opposed to just, it being this black monolith, right? All of that for me was very transformative.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when a lot of times people, either before they take psychedelics or, kind of when they're just thinking about them, or even just in general, I think people, they're a lot of the times afraid of non-existence. And so for them, the idea is that, and I often hear this in my session. So, I mean, I've talked about this extensively, I think another sort of on other platforms about sort of existential dread and the idea that a lot of times people are afraid of non-existence. And so it's like rationally what we go through in therapy is helping them understand that non-existence really isn't that scary. I mean, it's sad because obviously your consciousness is not going to be in the same way it was before, or maybe not
Yes.
at all. But the thing is that people a lot of times struggle with the notion of non-existence. And then so Samir, when you were taking psychedelics, did you feel like non-existence wasn't as terrifying for you then? Or the notion?
It's a question that has a sting in its tail, because I think the actual moments of self-dissolution and quote unquote non-existence for this I perspective, I don't think I actually experienced those moments. I didn't experience those moments. Samir was gone during those moments. And I know they have happened on these trips because there's been dissolution of time. I think I, with my ego intact, Samir, approaching a point where certain cognitive anchors that I have to my, to my constructed personality, when those anchors start to fall apart, I think that's when we experience what, Huxley described as the hell of the psychedelic experience, which is that you feel yourself dissolving and you feel non-existence approaching. The actual non-existence is not something that you will experience, right? But the sense of this ground crumbling from under you, the trapdoor opening, so to speak. I always think that I achieved a level of what I would call, intense meta-referentiality, where I could be thinking about myself and then catching myself thinking about myself. And all of a sudden these sort of infinite mirrors would open up. And I would realize that, that sort of tremendous sense of the conventionally constructed self, that any of these thoughts could be me. I could appoint any of these thoughts as the I and start becoming the guardian of all my other thoughts and then claiming them as mine. That was completely arbitrary. And when you realize that, it is terrifying because you feel yourself disappearing, right?
Would you say that that crumbling feeling, it's almost akin to facing your own death? Because how I mean this is, for example, while you are encountering that feeling, that dissolution, if you choose to surrender to it, that may lead into that better experience of the psychedelic experience. Otherwise, if you resist it, that may lead to that hellish, nightmarish realm.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Because you're essentially trying to hang on to this very elusive, slippery, anchoring thought, right? Remember, and you have this insight that actually, what I'm calling myself is that one of these thoughts that's kind of flitting around has appointed itself master, and it is surveying all the others, and it is saying, I'm having that thought. And it is claiming as its own content what the other thought is. And you realize this is completely arbitrary, right? And so you feel like, oh shit, this egotistical owner and possessor of all these things, this is actually just a little fiction that one of my thoughts has made up for itself. And it is parading around as the master of everything else in my mental domain. But there is no such master or ruler or, you really feel that I go, and that as that I goes, all the hooks of identity you had into it, whether they're emotional bonds with people, your job, your home, your income, your sense of achievement, these things, they become ephemeral. They're sort of vanishing, and you really lose your sense of who you are, and you feel non-existence approaching, and it's terrifying. And I think you're right to put it in that sense of ease or break, because as you try to hold on to it, it becomes terrifying. And you have to, in some ways, either be distracted by something, or you have to be prepared to just go along for the ride and, close your eyes, or, there's all these physical maneuvers to make yourself more comfortable so that you can, because the actual point of ego dissolution is actually experienceless. You're not there to experience it. Samir's not there. And then there comes another point when all of a sudden you're back. The the kaleidoscope reassembles and you're back, and something serves as an anchor to connect you with something that's happening, maybe a sound or something, and then you're back. And then you might, if you were alert enough in a controlled environment, you might check the time to see how long, you had been gone, so to speak. If you could press a button and say, well, I'm like freaking out now, but I'm relaxing. I'm thinking about neuroscientific investigations of these things about how long the loss of self was experienced.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's that headlong kind of slide towards a loss of everything that you knew and you held dear, and of course that's what your constructed sense of self is. And as that vanishes, I think that's terrifying.
And, I wonder from a psychotherapeutic standpoint, from the people who lose a sense of self, obviously something that you definitely talk about pretty often, about sort of hanging on to the ego and the ego's sort of assessment of itself and its desire to see itself only in sort of a bright light instead of, kind of acknowledging any of its flaws. So,
or a victim identity too,
yeah.
Actually.
So it's black and white,
too.
right? It's either you're like sort of like this victim and, you should be ashamed, or you're sort of like this great person and you need to sort of, kind of put yourself
or any narrative you identify with or believe. But
right. No, I got you. I like that you brought that up. So what I'm thinking is, when it comes to that, do you think that in terms of like taking, in terms of taking any of your psychedelics, let's say medications, do you feel as though the person, once they kind of lose that sense of self, or at least they lose it to some extent, that it kind of makes it more likely that they'll look at that sort of mirror in themselves, that they'll kind of acknowledge the sense of shame, or they'll acknowledge potential regrets, all of those things that have been hidden for, God knows how many years, that now all of a sudden, because let's say your attachment to yourself isn't where it was before, now you can kind of look at it from a bird's eye view and you can say, maybe, you know what, this isn't something that maybe I should be so ashamed of that I need to hide it from you.
Yeah. If I could use a spatial metaphor for the self, we are holding together a very tight network of connections and associations and valuations that make up myself. So who I am right now is someone that gets angry at particular things and happy at certain kinds of things because, I hold certain views and opinions on these topics. And so this kind of constellation of beliefs and, emotional attachments to them is me, right? In some sense. And I would say that in the psychedelic experience, what you have is a kind of shaking up and a kind of breaking up of this into something much looser, where your position with respect to these things is also displaced, right? So you see yourself from different perspectives. The kinds of emotional affects that you have with parts of yourself now are redistributed, right? You come to, for example, I think a very common experience on the psychedelic experience is that people come to see certain aspects of their life as suffused with a certain kind of beauty that they hadn't seen before. And this isn't just a simple matter of, people finding out, that painting in the room looks great, or, the music that they had sounds great. No, I think it's sometimes that they realize that the love and caring that they have in their lives is actually quite an amazing and wondrous thing, right? They're able to step back and say, look at this amazing thing. I've been with this woman for 20 years. We've gone through so many things. We've had all these fights and yet we're here together. There's something magical about all of this. And that's just the emotional halo that settles over some of these relationships in our life, which we haven't sort of turned to look at and been amazed by, right? I think that really kind of reorders, redistributes, reconfigures, it's like
reframing.
Connections between parts of ourselves get reconstructed somehow. And so the self that emerges on the other side is, I think that's why people feel that something quite significant has touched them, because the emotional affect that they had with the intellectual components of their mind have now been changed, right? Their beliefs aren't just like flat anymore. They're charged with a certain kind of emotional content to them because they have whatever the physical grounding of this, right? But the fact is that as far as our minds are concerned, we have had a very intensely emotional experience, one which has had a cognitive counterpart as well, right? And so depending upon our level of comfort with the aspects of the experience that are frightening, we might withdraw from some of them, and yet and yet visit other parts of ourselves, which people often find very pleasurable, the party experience, or, oh, it was just fun. And that's fine in its own way, because it also causes us to revisit the things that we enjoy, or to find new taste in them, or to find out what our hedonic limits are, and so on and so forth. And these are all valuable investigations into ourselves, but they all involve, I think you're right, to go back to your original insight, they all involve in some sense a kind of a rejiggering of the self in varying quantities and modalities, with the extreme, of course, being a kind of profound dissolution of the self, and the most minor one being just a kind of shake up of the sensory spectrum in some sense, right? That's kind of where you start from, right? And then it has this far-reaching spectrum of changes which people can experience and withdraw from, depending upon what their experience, dosage, prior mental history and conditions are, and what they're trying to get out of the experience as well.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people, I don't know if you guys would agree, would take the psychedelic medications for more so for kind of purpose, for psychological and personal reasons, rather than to answer kind of deeper philosophical questions, although I'm sure that happened. So yeah. I could tell you, so I'm pretty sure Alen had the same sort of, at least maybe the same sort of experience that I did with this. So I became really interested I became interested in psychedelics from Graham Hancock. And so I know you read Supernatural, right?
Yes. Graham Hancock, Terrence McKenna, Alan Watts.
Of course.
Mickey Leary.
So interestingly enough, Graham Hancock wrote this book, and I think it was along the lines of 2010, 2011, and it was called Supernatural Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind. So interestingly, even though like Graham Hancock is one of these people who he believes in Atlantis, and sort of he kind of sought out to prove in the spiritual, or I guess of the spiritual or whatever. But the thing is, in the kind of journey that he went through, he actually ended up seeing and talking to his deceased father. So what, at least maybe I'm wrong if I read the book a while ago, so maybe that was his intention, but I do know he's kind of really heavily philosophical. So, but as he got into the journey, I'm not necessarily sure that he got spiritual answers, although he may have, again, it's a vague memory. But the thing is, I definitely know he kind of sort of got to make up with his father in some way.
There was a reconciliation.
Yeah.
Right. That occurred within him.
Yeah. And so do you guys feel like for the most part, when people are doing that, they're sort of doing it to either overcome some sort of traumatic incident, to kind of make sense of a prior relationship, maybe make sense of something else that happened to them?
All three of those examples that you mentioned are, interestingly enough, the three most prominent examples that I've heard from friends of mine. One of my friends, survivor of sexual trauma, was in therapy for many years, took medication for many years. Then over the course of a couple of years, went for several ayahuasca ceremonies, including some in New York, some in South America. And she would testify that, you can't really speak quantitatively, but qualitatively, that the impact, the significance of the experiences, reconciliation, rehabilitation, reintegration, thinking through things, she felt it was as useful as all the years of therapy and medication put together. A friend of mine, also, similar exactly to the second instance you mentioned, of helping them understand past relationships, because they're able to revisit them. They're able to ransack their minds in ways that are not possible by psychoanalytic methods, for instance. Years of analysis of sort of rummaging through my unconscious. And I took these psychedelics, and they took me into this space that allowed me to, as you said, when people are speaking about having communication and connections with past loved ones and so on and so forth, very often it's a matter of, there is more to the human being, or more to the person than just the corporeal self. There's memories, associations, all these sorts of things, and they're a very rich part of our mind, and we can use those to work through. And I think that's one thing that psychedelics do facilitate. I was utterly unsurprised when I heard that something like MDMA, which is being used for patients who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think there is a very interesting side application, which I think the first time when I heard about MDA experiences, or, I experienced it myself, one of my first reactions was, it seems to me that people who are engaged in long-term relationships should take this substance together, because it was something that enabled, again, ego dissolution means what? That we lose certain kinds of vulnerabilities, or we become comfortable with them. We become more open to others. We let others into our emotional space. We are welcoming. We are more open in terms of talking about hurt, about the kinds of ways in which people have hurt us. And we're also open to telling people why we appreciate them. And I mean, and these were all experiences that were common to those who took MDMA, and I thought it was interesting that MDMA was dismissed as a kind of a party chemical. And I thought, really, only a supremely ignorant culture would think that people taking this chemical at the oldest cultural, consciousness raising ritual of all, musical festivals. It seemed to me that we were enacting ancient rituals and going to these musical concerts and, taking these substances, that people were actually sending us very strong cultural signals that actually we are connecting with ourselves in ways that are well known to us historically, and something that we've been comfortable with psychologically. Would it be any surprise that in these spaces we would find new ways of bonding with each other and like finding ways of healing relationships? People went to these kinds of festivals and often came back and said that, I had this magical experience with my friends, and it was, people are talking about these things 10 years later. It wasn't just that you had a party. It was that people connected with friends in deep and meaningful ways. And so I think all three of these, I think dealing with traumas, dealing with past relationships, because they have left either a traumatic or I would say a sort of an imprint of conflict in the present time. And I think dealing with present relationships. So I think PTSD is a very good example of people dealing with traumatic experiences and past relationships as well. Yeah. Sometimes those two can be combined in the same situation. And I think the use of MDMA for something like couples counseling is a very good instance, along with PTSD as well, as helping people open themselves up to certain kinds of experience, right?
And I wonder if the underlying mechanism to all of this is empathy. So.
I do think there is, and I think that might also have something to do with the neurophysiological mechanisms of this. The relationship between getting certain sorts of, for example, you think of something like facial recognition, right? Mm-hmm. So I smile when I see someone that I know, because the visual recognition is accompanied with the emotional stimulus of pleasure or joy at having seen the loved one, right? So these, maybe one of the ways in which these chemicals are working is activating these mechanisms in completely new ways, so that the associations between certain kinds of recognition and certain kinds of emotional affects are strengthened or amplified, or we are able to dedicate ourselves to them. And as a result, the emotional affect is increased when we're not distracted by other effects. So I think these kinds of very interesting, I would say, interactions or influences on personal relationships that are made up of these kinds of affective bonds, it's something that really bears further investigation. And I'm so happy to see that so much of research is now being done. It's, many formal aspects of the psychiatric machinery are sort of getting on board. And I think, psychiatry has a good chance to, redeem itself and lead the way in making this, not necessarily lead the way, but, at least bring in parts of the medical establishment on board in terms of having these substances investigated in all sorts of, controlled trials and experimental settings. And, and of course, and I hope also that, that we have the corresponding legal machinery that goes along with this, so that people can partake of these in ceremonies and in gatherings with friends and with others, because we have a history of cultural connections with these substances, and it would be a shame to lose the accumulated knowledge of thousands and thousands of years of like human interactions with these substances across cultures. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating for me now is viewing the interest in psychedelics as a chance to bridge certain sorts of cultural barriers, to enable certain sorts of cultural understandings, precisely because of the perspectives that psychedelics enable. And, to do so in a way that is respectful of the accumulated knowledge of, indigenous traditions that have often experimented with these medicines in many different ways. From what I can make out, a lot of the people that are doing some of the ayahuasca ceremonies are quite respectful of the traditions, but, as the phenomena tends to become bigger, there'll be some need for caution out here so that it doesn't just become something commodified and, disrespected, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, usually ayahuasca ceremonies are headed by shamans, right?
Yeah. I think the formal structure, of course, within indigenous societies that have used something like ayahuasca, there's a formal structure there. There's a relationship of the plant to other parts of the lived life, right? It's not just something that's kind of dropped in the middle of this. It's not like this little sprinkle on addition. It's integrated with other parts of their life. So I think there is a value to realizing what that integration is, right? Because, as they say, that if you are going to interact with the mother plant, you interact in such a way that is, what you're getting into, and so that the mother plant knows what she's getting into. So I think I think to have that mindset, to go into that experience, I think makes the experience just that much more powerful, because it is framed appropriately for you. And whether it's, understanding what is happening to you during the ceremony in terms of the spatial metaphors or the caring metaphors, because they have an emotional resonance. If you really do take the metaphors on board, they will affect the content of your experience.
Yeah, and having a reverence for the experience itself is very important. If somebody goes into it blind, I mean, that's where it could go either way. You could have that bad trip, or potentially you could have a good trip, but you wouldn't know just doing it yourself. Sometimes it's good to have either a sitter or a clinician, which is interesting because that's becoming more of a mainstream thing. Or like a shaman.
And like I said, because we don't have, it's not like we have formal training programs for shamans. This is a classically human thing where people have sort of, somebody I met at ayahuasca ceremony, he said, I have 28 years of experience in this. I've been going to South America, and say, that's good enough for me, right? And so there was this kind of encounter between me and him, mediated by another friend of mine. And I think that's how a lot of these human, encounters and settings go. And I think people exercise caution and diligence. And hopefully, as people talk about this, more of the background knowledge, or sort of more of what one's framing of the experience should be, can be talked about openly. You use the word of reverence, and I think reverence and curiosity is very necessary, and patience, and I think a willingness to continue to think about this on an ongoing basis, and I think
well, and I wonder, right? Again, going back to sort of the idea of ego disillusionment, I wonder if, I'm sure you guys know, kind of with cognitive therapy and the framework, we have these sort of core beliefs that we have, beliefs about ourselves, beliefs about other people, beliefs about the world. And often, especially, in therapy, it's very hard to help people examine them because it's very hard to get people to challenge them. So we're often very stubborn in our thinking, and we're so sure of ourselves.
Yeah.
And so you might have another person, like, let's say I might believe something, right? And then Alen on the other side would say, hey, no, man, like I have all of this information and all of this evidence that says this isn't true. And I'm like, fuck you, Alen. I don't want to hear anything that you have to say, right? And that sometimes happens in therapy. And so it's like you're kind of trying your best and your best and your best. And then sometimes maybe something catastrophic would happen, and then the person comes back and says, oh shit, you were actually right. So I wonder if in some way that catastrophic thinking is actually these sort of either ayahuasca or whatever other, kind of medicinal experiences these people would have, but if sort of they allow the ego or the stubbornness to break down where they can actually examine the evidence. And so it's like, if you're coming from a perspective of some sort of personal trauma, and you're so sure that you're worthless, or that you're kind of unworthy or useless or whatever it is, kind of, you, again, going back to that bird's eye view, you get to empathize with yourself in some way, because those barriers might not necessarily be broken down, but maybe there's a sort of distance between you and your core belief, where you kind of look at them on the outside and say, okay, I'm going to actually now be able to, or I'm going to give myself the chance to examine them. Whereas like in reality, when a person talks to you about them, you're very quick to shut them down. Like I've had this happen in therapy many times, where you're trying to show the person like, hey, I know you believe this, but here's all of this information that says maybe your belief is only partially true. And they're like, oh, you're just trying to be nice. I don't, you're like a fucking therapist. You're supposed to say these things. I don't care. La, 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 la. I don't need to listen to you. Right. And so, but I wonder if the kind of ayahuasca experiences is really this in your face experience of reality, where it's something, again, I don't know from personal experiences, so I can't say for sure, but it's just a hunch that there's some part of the mind that says like, no, dude, it's time for you to actually look at this stuff.
Yeah, I would say, I would just make that a little bit more precise. I don't know, precise is the right word, but I would use the language of beliefs and emotions in talking about that, which is that, think of something like forgiveness, right? And I want to think about why there might be a certain kind of rigidity when it comes to forgiveness, right? Somebody does something wrong to me, right? Mm-hmm. And then I am asked to forgive them and to move on, right? It is explained to me, someone comes to me and says, look, that time when you thought your brother was disrespecting you, when he didn't call you on your birthday, actually that day, this happened, right? So you kind of told something, and there's a belief you have associated with that, and you kind of change your belief, but the emotion associated with the belief, or the emotion that belief was supposed to cause and which put in place, that hasn't gotten dislodged from its place. And so what happens is that you kind of do this rational forgiveness, but you haven't done this emotional forgiveness. And so 2 months later down the line, when you have a fight with that same person, your lack of emotional forgiveness infuses now that conflict with a greater urgency, with a greater pungency than it had before. So what you really need to do is to come to that point of emotional forgiveness. You need to have your rational forgiving and your emotional forgiving come together. Along with the belief, you need to experience the affect of actually forgiving this person. Mm-hmm. I would say a very, very significant part of the psychedelic experience is that belief and affect come together very powerfully. That when you think about people, when you think about various claims, when you run together certain kinds of arguments in your mind, when you think of somebody or you perceive certain acts of theirs, there's a kind of an emotional and an affective charge that goes with it that makes it possible for you to forgive people, that makes it possible for you to think of people and to think of them in this way that is like, wow, I've been lifting weights with this guy in the gym for the past 5 years. And it's always just like, hey dude, what's up? And we rack the weights, we lift the weights, and then we leave. All right, yo, I'll see you tomorrow. Like this guy, he's been helping me be strong for the last 5 years. You know, he's my fucking rock, this guy. He's my backbone. He's like actually like making me into who I am. And I need to appreciate this. Like I need to really take this on board and not just be so blasé about this thing in my life, right? And so it really honestly happened to me. Like I went to the gym, you know, over the next week, I was like throwing hugs all around. Like, you know, these people are making it possible for me to be a better version of myself. Because like they show up in class, they work out, they cheer me on, I cheer them on, right? And it's just like, we're just like, you know, it's just, but they're not just friends. They're far more significant than that. And you come to realize that. And it's not just this kind of, somebody points it out to you and you're like, oh yeah, I see that. You see it and you feel it. And you see it and you feel it. And when you see it and you feel it, you understand it differently. You see it differently as a result, right? Yeah. Because it's not just that seeing is believing, it's that believing is seeing, right? So when you feel differently about this person, it's not the same person anymore. They're a different person.
And then it also seems like what you're saying potentially from a psychedelic experience, what you're talking about is essentially a broadened perspective of a relationship that you have with someone that on the surface just seems to be, you know, this trivial thing, but there's this deeper sort of context to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's, you know, deeper context is a very good way of putting it. You become aware, to use, you know, a phrase that's going to sound far out. You become aware of its cosmic significance. In my life, there are these stations and people are taking me from station to station. And at this moment, you know, the most precious of journeys, this guy's my fellow traveler. And I should acknowledge that. It's not just some dude, you know. This is something invested with importance.
Yeah, I felt that in my own experiences. I would say back in my early 20s, I would start to look at other people as me. Like this person is also me, just in a different body. Not necessarily my identity, of course,
Yeah.
but that it would allow me to also be able to forgive them, or to
Yeah.
see where they're coming from, or just give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe something had happened to them earlier, or something like that. Maybe that's why they're being mean, or something like that. Or
Yeah.
if,
Yeah.
it's strange. It's just changed my experiences with other people, giving them that benefit of the doubt. It's led to better relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I think that there's this moment in which, if I was ever able to extend to the other person the understanding that I had of myself, I am this, and I think this happens on the psychedelic experience. You realize, to go back to that lyric, you are the eyes of the world. You are the world made consciously manifest at this point in space and time, and that you've decided to call this I. And you realize the other person, your girlfriend, your mother, your friend, the bus driver, that's them too. Mm-hmm. And they too are this locus of that consciousness, just like I'm sort of, something on the inside is peeking out from here. That's them too. And I feel, all right, we are in this together. Mm-hmm. And that feeling of being, we're in this together, psychonauts will say this to each other when they, when we're talking, somebody says to each other, hey, am I talking about trips or whatever? Mm-hmm. Everybody will agree. There is one point during the trip where you will say to the other person who is with you, if you are tripping with someone, you will say, man, I wish everybody in the world could feel what I'm feeling right now. Because you want everybody to get it at the same time. Because if everybody gets it at the same time, we're good, right?
Yeah.
And anybody who has been into that eye of the storm knows exactly the moment I'm talking about. You turn to the other person, you say, dude, everybody should feel this. And that's like really, you feel like, okay, we are, I get it. We're all kind of, this is all of us. And that's that connection exactly that you were talking about. And that makes you, it makes you kinder, more, I don't know, even if it's a brief moment.
No, for sure. There was this one experience I had, again, in my early 20s. Before that, I was a little more, I had read books like Power of Now. I'd learned about being present to the moment. I'd made strides in my own personal journey of just being more with it, being less resistant, less reactive, being aware of the ego, such and such, which was great. I had made great strides in that area. However, I'd still had aspects of myself that were closed off, that wouldn't allow me to connect with someone or to expose myself more to the world. I was still more to myself, more private. There were these ideas that I wanted to share with other people, but I just didn't have the bravery, or I couldn't even label it at the time.
Yeah.
But then I had this one particular experience that was, I won't necessarily go into the details of what necessarily went on, but it was so profound. The immense feelings, the emotions, the breaking down of certain psychological barriers, that by the time I had, well, I wouldn't call this a reintegration, but by the time things had settled down, the very next day I'd called all of my family, friends I hadn't spoken to in many years, and said, how are you doing? And there was zero of this tension that existed before, that didn't allow for me to make that step in order to reach out to these people.
Yeah.
And that was beautiful. That was a nice thing. Yeah.
And it's interesting, you didn't use this word, but I think it's lurking in there, which is that you accept yourself in a way that you hadn't before. And when you accept yourself, you want to let others know that there's a new version of you in town. One that doesn't just see himself in a different light as a result, but sees other people in a different light as a result. And you want to let others know that, because you can sense that people have been trying to tell you something about themselves, and you've not been taking it on board because you've not been taking parts of yourself on board. And I think it was amazing to, sometimes it felt like I was just flattering people, but I think it felt amazing for me to be able to tell people that their presence in my life was this kind of amazing, this shining facet of this diamond that they didn't know they were. I remember there was this woman, I remember talking to her, and I said to her, I said, there's a very interesting way in which I think about you being someone whom my daughter could admire because of the way in which you conduct yourself. And this friend of mine started crying. And she couldn't believe that I had said to her that my daughter could find her admirable, as a kind of a role model. And I did think she was. I think, she's a very talented woman. She has multiple talents. She's, she's very physically dynamic. She was doing jujitsu and all this kind of stuff. So I thought wow, she's tough, she's smart, she's beautiful. There's all these ways in which she's, I think my daughter would find someone admirable here, but I never said it to her explicitly. But now I had, and I could say it because it was just, I had so much to give away almost, right? In terms of generosity. And it wasn't costing me anything to tell people that they were, these amazing presences in my life. And then to see that happiness in her, right? That was instant confirmation that I'd done the right thing.
Yeah, what's so interesting is that sometimes people get shocked by this. And sometimes like when I'll give a person a compliment, they'll say something like, what? Like, what, you really? And
really?
Because yeah, no shit. Like, how did you know this? Like, I feel like I'm not going to say it because you probably already know it. So what am I repeating something that someone else said? Yeah, but it's interesting how little people actually compliment one another. I've actually found that to be true. Very rarely. And even amongst like friend groups, like you'll very rarely have that. It's so interesting. People are just afraid.
And like people will knock it back if you actually do give them a compliment. They're like, get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is like for whatever reason, people just don't compliment each other, and I never really got that. It's like it's as though there's some sort of fear of being exposed or of being vulnerable. Yeah. Like if I say something nice about you, somehow you're going to be able to later on use that against me.
Yeah, that's right. Or like, I have somehow conceded some power to you by saying, you're a really important person in my life. Oh, fuck. That means now you're going to take your presence away from me.
I'm important, huh?
Yeah.
The appropriate response is, of course, thank you. If if somebody says that to you,
right. And I think, it speaks to a certain kind of fear and an insecurity that if you actually alert someone to the fact that they're doing a good thing for you, they will somehow feel that, they should either start charging you for it, or they should withdraw it, or, some other kind of negative relationship with this good thing will emerge. So maybe the best thing to do is to just kind of keep it, incognito and let them continue to do this good thing, sort of completely oblivious to the fact that they're having this great effect on me. Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've actually had that with clients before. So I would have like clients who don't just, some of my clients, which is fine. I mean, they don't tell me anything, right? So it's like therapy just seems to be going. They seem to get some benefit from it. I'm obviously getting some benefit from it. Everything's going okay. And then I would have like sometimes people refer other people to me. And then so interestingly enough, what happens is, so like, let's say I would end treatment with someone, right? And then that person who they referred me to would say, hey, like, did you know that person thought like your work together was really amazing? And I'm like, what? She never said any of that to me before. Where did that even come from? And when I would ask like, hey, like, what is it that you took away from therapy? What didn't you like? What would you have wanted more of? They're like, no, it was good. It was fine. It worked well. And I'm like, yeah. I'm like, okay, I guess you're a satisfied customer.
The common theme in all of this really is, if you return to the, to the thread that began this, is that there's a certain kind of rigidity in certain positions that we take on in beliefs, perspectives, opinions, and that rigidity in the, if you wanted to get very mechanical about what the effect of the psychedelic experience is, that rigidity is the thing that comes under the greatest pressure in the psychedelic experience. And I think it is unavoidable that almost anybody who writes in this, they are profoundly impressed by the power of the psychedelic experience, by just how radical a departure sometimes it presents from human consciousness. I mean, after all, we are constantly changing our consciousness during the day, right? I mean, this is it's a very fluctuating kind of, our sensory field, our phenomenal field, our affective field is changing every single second of the day, and we are changing it. This morning I went and climbed something which was a little bit out of my difficulty range, just a teensy bit. And I was in a whole new mental space, man, on that rock. It was fucking amazing. There's no other way to describe it. Mm-hmm. And, what the psychedelic experience does, precisely because it is so powerful, is that it teaches you the tenuousness of the original positions you were holding. So it's not just that it disrupts those positions, it teaches you that there is a fundamental tenuousness to any position that you can take on, right? So, I think that's why, when sometimes people make these connections between the psychedelic experience and sort of various Eastern philosophies, I think Alan Watts is a prime example of this, someone who I think, in the 60s, he was a expert psychonaut himself, and he was a scholar, and I think those two things fed into each other. I think he found insights in Eastern philosophies that I think are there to be found in terms of cosmic unity, cosmic wholeness, and oneness. These metaphors are, they're not just metaphors; they're parts of these teachings, and they have a great deal to do with states of consciousness that are attained during intense, states of mindfulness and meditation, that are aiming in many ways for certain states of ego dissolution, which people find in the psychedelic experience. So it's not surprising that the insights that people have are, can communicate with each other, or that people on the two sides of this divide have found, a language with which to inform those two, with these kinds of influences. And I think Watts is the classic example of that. But I think, once again, to get back to the point about therapy and rigidity and why it has therapeutic potential, it's precisely because these sorts of things represent perspectival departures and reminders that states of consciousness are fragile, states of consciousness are, transient, that they represent, even if you use, and I think that's the amazing thing about the psychedelic experience. Let's say that you're a hardcore materialist, right? You're a physicalist. You're not even talking about anything that's, if you want to be all like, oh, no spirituality, no spookiness. I mean, even for the hardcore materialist, what is it telling us? It's telling us that we are physical beings, a biochemical soup, right? I mean, that's what the physicalist wants us to believe. Sure, I'll go with you. We're a biochemical soup. Consciousness is a chemical phenomenon. I'm with you, physicalist. We're right on board, buddy. I'm still going with you. But what that means is that there is a chemical equilibrium between this biochemical soup and the rest of the physical world outside. And that interaction is my consciousness. And that thing is so fragile and such a beautiful, sensitive, constructed equilibrium that I took the drop of this tiny chemical and I dropped it in there. And lo and behold, that physical relationship changed and we had a completely different state of consciousness. And there are many others, as we all know, thanks to our changing states of mind during the day. So I think becoming aware that we are just such, creatures in flux, it makes our cognitive rigidity seem a little silly. I think many folks, when they return from trips, are kind of mortified that they held on to some beliefs so strongly, right? Because they've received such a buffeting. For example, you hold the beliefs about yourself, like, oh, I was silly to think that in the first ever place. Or sometimes you become aware that in fact the psychedelic experience is clearing away a certain kind of cognitive clutter and opening the door to other kinds of experiences to come in. So there's this kind of door, right, which you've been keeping blocked. And there's a kind of a sweeping away, just a kind of a making room. And these new experiences can come in and be experienced. And I think that's very useful for thinking about folks that are struggling with issues like self-esteem, right? And I think are dealing with a constant inner monologue, which is self-destructive, which is pathological. And it's a very, and I would call it a monologue that essentially crowds out other kinds of dialogues that we can have with ourselves. Right.
Right. And I mean, a lot of it is also founded in fear. So when you talk about those core beliefs of, I'm useless, I'm worthless, etc., a lot of times there's usually plenty of evidence, to the contrary. But the person who believes in it, well, first of all, there's obviously black and white thinking. But then the other thing is it's founded in fear. It's what if, right? What if I actually accept the evidence? What if I reframe my belief? What if I start thinking of myself differently? What if I start putting myself out there? What if that person who I'm sure is never going to want to go out with me, even though they say they will? What if I actually sort of give them a date, right? What if I then look stupid? What if I'm then even more ashamed than I feel now? So
and
it's
there's
like
deep anxiety. There's a deep anxiety at every level of this.
Yep. However, imagine if the doors of perception were cleansed in the sense that maybe you wouldn't imagine those thoughts were not there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had the mental resources to have other thoughts, or even no thoughts, perhaps. Maybe then it's more peaceful. It depends. Because I have this distinction I like to make between, there's a time to brainstorm and to critically think and to actually have a sort of inner monologue. And there's other times where you don't want that. You may want peace and quiet. You may not want that ruminating dialogue to even have a place in your life.
Well, I think that corresponds precisely to stages of the psychedelic experience where you have the so-called maelstrom, right? And then you have, the so-called coming down, where in fact it's almost as if you are physically and mentally exhausted by what you have experienced. And in fact, to use the yogic term, when you do the shavasana at the end of, when you lie flat on your back and you have the corpse pose, there is a moment when all you should be doing is just taking it on board, feeling and not necessarily cognizing it excessively. The exact opposite of a brainstorm, a kind of a brain sleep or a brain chillax, or, I don't know what the right word for it would be in this sense. A certain settling down to a more quiescent state and to begin to process the thoughts and disruptions that you went through just before, and to start to begin slowly that process of, trying to understand what you've just undergone.
Right. It's kind of as though as you're backing away from your ego, you're also backing away from the affect. So like in this case, it's anxiety. And as you're backing away from the anxiety, then with a clearer mind, you can actually look at everything that's happened in your life and ask yourself, okay, does my life really indicate all of these shit things that I believe about myself? Do all of these people really hate me? Or is it that it's kind of like my core belief informing my assumptions about them, kind of the way they see me, the way they're interacting with me? Or is it that they've tried to tell me that, I was wrong, but I just didn't want to listen to it? Or maybe I was too afraid to listen to it.
Yeah. And I think, that's precisely why some aspects of this can be frightening for people, because, very often affects run quite close to their contraries. And, so fear can turn to ecstasy, and ecstasy can turn to fear. You see something unfamiliar and beautiful, and it can be cause for, ecstatic reaction. It can be cause for something that can make you deeply anxious and fearful as well. And I think it's that sensitivity that makes the experience the kind of thing which is precisely why people have guides, they have shamans, they have, in the modern therapeutic setting, therapists or counselors or clinicians, people who can be experienced in the chemical sense, and also in some ways be guides for the journey, or prompt certain kinds of explorations. And I'm kind of, I really do think that the potential here is just kind of amazing. It's just, it's amazing that you've been bringing up these examples from therapeutic practice, of talking about certain kinds of interactions that you have in that clinical space, and it's amazing because as you keep bringing them up, and you're bringing them up in the context of this conversation, their connection with, or their potential for psychedelic intervention just becomes so clear, right? Once, because so many times in the therapeutic setting, what you are talking about is a certain kind of cognitive rigidity, right? And that's not to understand it as a pathology. It's to understand it maybe in some ways as a perfectly good strategy that has worked for people in the past. And,
it's protection.
I had to have beliefs of this kind, right? And, and then that's a very classic instance. Or in some ways, because a certain kind of relationship between belief and affect has gone wrong. And I think in each of these cases, what we're really talking about are a variety of substances with a variety of effects, which have, by virtue of their physical interaction with the architecture of our cognitive apparatus, have the ability to introduce these changes in our consciousness, which make us question, first of all, I think the conventional nature of our consciousness, the agreed upon experience that we are all having. And I think secondly, to visit points of departure from it, and to use those points of departure as ways of re-understanding ourselves. And when we think about it, all the therapeutic experiences that we're seeking, whether they're religious, whether they're intellectual, whether they are physically induced by running and climbing and skiing, or whether it's the counseling experiences that we seek, in each of these experiences, we're really seeking ways to reconfigure ourselves cognitively. We are seeking ways to think differently. We want to think differently, right? So when we go in with that open mind and we say, look, I'm going to read this book because I want to learn something, or I want to have this experience because I want to feel something different. And as a result, think something differently, or I'm going into counseling. I think that openness is precisely the openness that's present in these experiences. So we shouldn't be surprised when these kinds of experiences are informed by these substances. You know, and I think they represent a kind of a natural point, a natural locus of the way in which we have used the outside world to guide us in our interactions with it. You know, it's not surprising that once, you know, cultures all over the world discovered these substances, you know, whatever they were, you know, tobacco, alcohol, you know, anything that would modify our consciousness, because they fitted in seamlessly into a kind of a continuum of ways in which we are constantly changing the way we, you know, the way we perceive ourselves and others. So I think, you know, when, you know, to bring it back to where this conversation started, you know, we were talking about philosophy, therapy, and psychedelics, right? I mean, that's the kind of triangle, right, in some sense. And the triangle, I think, is philosophy is a form of therapy. Philosophy is a kind of therapeutic intervention. And therapeutic interventions are guided, aided, and abetted by these tools and substances that help us change and modify consciousness. And philosophy is an investigation into the nature of being and the nature of reality. And these tools and substances, by altering our consciousness, by altering our mind, which is how we study reality, they teach us something about the relationship between our mind and reality. So I think the triangle is really, you know, it's a kind of a wondrous triangle. And it's a very, you know, it's a very fundamental and foundational triangle of human experience.
Right. And I think that it's all mind. If you kind of think about it, when we're talking about cognitive reframing, and there's also a form of therapy called exposure therapy. And so sometimes the idea is that these two are sort of, they're sort of disparate and they're kind of placed against one another. And the idea is like, well, you can have kind of exposure therapy where, like, let's say with trauma, you know, you sort of keep talking about it over and over again, and eventually you stop caring. And then let's say if you're afraid of spiders or whatever, you know, you kind of see a spider over and over again and you stop caring. But it's all cognitive. It's all mind. Because even whether the therapist is proving to you sort of through philosophical argumentation that something is wrong, or whether you're kind of experiencing it yourself, one way or another, right? Or even if it's a psychedelic experience where you're learning of something new, the experience is a form of learning. Either way, it's all founded within your ways of seeing yourself, seeing the world, seeing other people. It all comes back to mind in the end. Because even when we're talking about exposure therapy is only important because you have a brain that can think. If you can't process what you're learning in the experience, it's all irrelevant. There's nothing to expose you to.
Exposure therapy is sort of presuming a certain kind of cognitive architecture. It is presuming that you change and that you learn, you change your beliefs and you learn in particular ways. I mean, it wouldn't work without this kind of cognitive assumptions. And I think, you know, when you think of the mental illnesses or the so-called mental disorders, the so-called mental health disorders, I don't think it's that, you know, other than those for which we have found that, you know, and there's a vanishingly small number of mental disorders that have physical correlates. You know, the rest of these are essentially being treated quite blindly. If you think of the fact that what you're essentially getting is this very powerful kind of, you know, it's a pharmaceutical, I would say, in some ways. You know, you can think of it as a pharmaceutical, but I think it's a pharmaceutical that's interesting precisely because the effects it has are not to be understood just in terms of physical changes, but in terms of changing your interpretation of your beliefs, or changing your beliefs, or changing the emotional affects of beliefs, and then helping you process that. So there is a sense in which, yes, there is a pharmaceutical intervention of a cognitive therapy. And I think that's the kind of, you know, I mean, that's true of the relationship between psychiatry and psychotherapy, where even if you're taking medications, you're supposed to be in talk therapy, that, you know, as a way of helping you understand. And I think that's how good therapy would proceed. And I think the therapist who works with medications at that time could be, you know, could come from a variety of modalities. You know, I think, I have a psychiatrist friend, and, you know, we have this understanding that if he thinks there are people who could benefit from philosophical counseling, that, you know, I could work with his patients, right? As, you know, he could recommend me as someone who could help his patients talk through the effects that the medication is happening on them. And I think psychedelics would fit in quite nicely into this space, because the idea would be that you could take it in a variety of clinical settings, but it's not just giving you the chemical and, you're sort of sent on your own way to go ahead and, have the psychedelic experience. It's more that you're there and you are counseled, and that you build a set of interpretations around the experience to help you understand it and to help you understand yourself better.
And just to be
and that's a common theme, set and setting always, right?
Yes.
Structuring that is so important for the psychedelic experience, because without an intent, or just letting it just roam free, it can be good, but the potential for disaster is also great.
Yeah, there's a high probability.
So guiding it a certain way is paramount to having a very successful experience with it.
And also
sorry, I was just going to say, the way ayahuasca ceremonies are framed, that you bring questions for the mother, I think is a really good way to think about it.
That's so interesting.
You have come seeking an audience with the mother, right? When you come seeking an audience, speak your mind. What is in your mind? What is it you wish to speak about? You can't just say, "Oh, I'm here to see the mother." No, you're here to see the mother for some reason, right? What's on your mind, right? And the moment you think about that, it forces immediately that introspective impulse. Why am I doing this?
Right.
And if you start thinking in that line when you are on ayahuasca, well, then I think you are down the path that you need to be going, which is questioning yourself and asking yourself, what has brought you here? And you will find that there is something that has brought you there, something quite particular, right?
And just to be clear for our audience, so we're definitely not recommending that anybody take psychedelics on their own, because not regardless, regarding like what sort of medications you're taking, there could be some really sort of toxic interaction. And then the other thing is, if you have a family history of any sort of psychosis, schizophrenia, delusional disorder, any of that, which you probably don't even know of, because most people do not know their family history of mental illness, it could actually induce a psychotic break, which will turn into a psychiatric and then a psychotic disorder as well.
Formal disclaimer for the audience.
Yeah. We just want to be clear.
And also, let's not forget that the legality of these substances is quite a dubious matter in many jurisdictions. So,
right.
And I think that's the amazing thing about this, because the legality of these substances, they're still illegal, right? And yet the cultural moment is such that we're having conferences on psychedelics all the time, and the Journal of Psychiatry is publishing papers on psilocybin, and so I think there's an interesting cultural discordance here about the continued illegality and the actual cultural moment that we're having.
Right. And I mean, we can even talk about the preliminary studies, because outside of kind of ketamine, which no, we're not really talking about ketamine, but just FYI, it kind of has been working like a placebo as far as like what I know and what other researchers have shown, where it's like it kind of does this uptick, and then after a little bit, it sort of goes back down and you're sort of depressed again. But with like other medications, right? Whatever medications, with I think psilocybin, and then I think the other one was peyote. So there's actually been some really interesting research, preliminary research into its effects on depression, the cessation of smoking, I think anxiety of various sorts, whether social, social, general, and then I think some other things too. So, I mean, obviously we need more broader sort of, long-term studies, but the idea is, what's so interesting is that right now they're actually showing, again, preliminary studies, but what they're showing is that some of these, like, they work better than medications. So that's really interesting.
Yeah. No, I think without many of the side effects that make people so uncomfortable with many of the antipsychotic, antidepressant medications, without many of the dependency problems, I think that's very, very interesting. I mean, when you think about a large part of the reason why sometimes people don't want to get into these medications is because, they're worried about personality changes that are quite upsetting for them. They're quite upset about side effects. And as a result, family around it is often not comfortable with the medications. So I think this, the potential that we're looking at for these possible episodic treatments, and with, which could be outpatient or, just like you go in for the afternoon, right? Vice had a very interesting special where one of their correspondents who had worked as a war correspondent in several war zones, he was reporting a form of PTSD. From just having been sent to these war zones again and again, and exposed to shelling, seeing dead bodies, seeing killings, and this sort of stuff. And they showed a couple of his MDMA sessions because it was being used to treat war veterans as well, helping them deal with some of their traumatic past. And yeah, it was a very interesting episode. And, like I said, NYU is having a conference every October, which is a 2-day conference. I think, I'm not sure if they're going to have it this year, but it's a fairly extensive and a very serious conference. And, John Hopkins has a research program now on psychedelics and psychiatry. There's a special interest group within the American Psychiatric Association. So I think the medical establishment is, or at least portions of it, are gearing up and getting on board. And I think, what really needs to happen down the line is that if this is really going to become a research program, then I think the legal barriers really need to be sort of reworked so that in fact we can have, I think what we really need to have is this kind of explosion of, papers published that will corroborate and, confirm these studies and actually lead to larger research trials being launched.
Absolutely.
I mean, that at least is my, is my formal hope on the political legal front,
Yeah, because as you know, having had a psychedelic experience, it is incredibly profound. A lot of people anecdotally have said it's in their top 5 most meaningful experiences they've ever experienced in their life.
Yeah.
That ego-dissolution, or let's put it this way, you could make an argument that the ego is the root for almost all conflict that we've seen in the world. And imagine having access to something that dissolves that false entity, right? And allows for connection and for brotherhood, for compassion. And if that were something that more people were taking, I wonder what kind of shift that would cause in society if more people were experiencing and having that sort of experience.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's that thought that you're expressing, that's always been the dream at the heart of, all those folks who were sticking, flowers into, gun battles. In a way, they were expressing that hope that when you find out that, that the way in which people sort of mock the hippies, hey man, we're all one, that there was actually something quite deep at the heart of all of that. And there was, even if you realize that the ego that you have is something that you need in order for social existence, the fact that you were able to step out of that once and to see, okay, this thing is this kind of temporary conventional thing that I kind of put together to maintain my social sense of identity. And, I have all these relationships and all that kind of stuff, and people have given me a name and all that. But once you just get that slight distance from it, maybe you take on, a little bit of, what, Dylan called the Joker perspective. It's all good. It's a little bit of a cosmic joke, right? That which we take ourselves so seriously. And once you just get that little wink going on the side, right? And I think that's why so much of psychedelic art involves that jester or that Joker perspective, because you realize that this is all a little bit of a joke. You being so puffed up with this ego and this whole sort of the pretension, right? And that just falls apart. Yeah. And when you realize it, that this balloon can be punctured, it gives you a different relationship to that balloon. And I think that's what we might not be able to keep that sense of ego dissolution with us all the time, right? But having known that this thing, when you pull back the curtain, you're like, oh man, I pulled back the curtain once. There wasn't anything there, right? You just don't take it that seriously from that point onwards.
Absolutely. Man, such a great discussion. All right, Alen, final questions for Samir before we go?
Oh, yes, Samir. Do you have anything to promote?
Oh, no, I'm working on my book on anxiety, and which, I hope to finish by next year, a philosophical guide to anxiety. And it's interesting that I think some of these conversations will play a role in that book. I've also just written an essay on anxiety for the magazine Psyche, which is a sister magazine for Eon. And I'm trying to talk a little bit about the relationship of anxiety to basic philosophical inquiry, suggesting that, philosophical inquiries sparked by a certain kind of anxiety to get the right answer as well.
All right.
Yeah. So, other than that, nothing to promote except the writing that I'm working on.
Oh, I was hoping also, sorry, to ask where we could follow you on social media
Which
as
is
well.
my question.
Oh, yeah.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
So all my writing and all my writings on these subjects and many others, they're all available at my website, samirchopra.com, which is my blog and my repository of writing. And on social media, I have a blog page on Facebook, just Samir Chopra as well. And on Twitter, I'm Chopra Counselor and Eye on the Pitch.
Awesome.
And you guys have very kindly, passed on my work to other people. So thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, guys. This was a great conversation. Yep. I had a lot of fun today, and I'm looking forward to this going online.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite episodes. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
All right. Take care, Samir. Talk soon.
All right, guys. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. That was awesome.
That was dope.
That was awesome.
That was really dope. Yeah.
Well, everybody, of course, thanks for watching. If you want to follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, and on Twitter at Seize_podcast. And also you can follow us at O4L Online.
Yes, at the O4L Online Network at O4LOnlineNetwork.com. And you can find us under the STM podcast section.
All right. Well, guys, thanks again for watching, and see you guys next time.